On June 16th, 1963, we broke ground to construct this building. And in the 60 years between then and now, it served us well. That's something like 3,000 or more Sundays of church. And it's hundreds of events and dinners and auctions and gatherings and weddings and memorials. 4 years of our guests living in sanctuary. There was a new expansion in the 80s, a new parking lot in the 90s, a new playground in the 2000s, I may be slightly off on my years, a new kitchen in the 2010s, and buildings get old. And it costs more and more to do nothing with a building. Let me give you 2 examples, though, of buildings getting old. So the heat in this room is forced hot air. Great, straightforward. But the way that it moves around the room is through ductwork in the floor. And the way that the ductwork in the floor was built was that when the concrete was poured, they put in, those great big tubes, like those heavy-duty cardboard tubes? Well, they put those in and they poured the concrete around it, and it works perfectly fine as long as it never gets wet. But if, for example, there's a flood, like there was 10 years ago, I remember seeing the photo of Fox standing up to his knees in the front of the room here in the flood. Well, it tends to mess with your cardboard. And we think there are spots around this room where some of that cardboard is flapping down, is preventing some of the airflow. This whole topic is, I see Tom Zanoni getting less and less excited because he knows it. He's been digging through. Let me give you another example. There are very, very few right angles in this building, right? But there is one right angle for sure in this building, and the right angle is the plumbing junction where the outflow from 2 restrooms come together. It goes like this. This is not what I thought I would be preaching about. All right, so here's how the plumbing goes. It comes down, it comes together, and there's a T-junction, just like that. Well, if any of you are plumbers, we need your help. if any of you, and I'm not, the way you build plumbing junctions today is a Y junction. Because if you think about your car merging onto the highway, you don't merge onto the highway at a T junction, you merge on in a Y junction, right? All of this I learned from the Roto-Rooter guy last month. Buildings get older. Last fall, more than 6 of us gathered for visioning to imagine what is the future of our faith home. What's the future of the building, of a building that we want? And I so appreciate that the process did not begin, and in fact, at no point in the process was the question, should we move or should we stay? That's not what visioning is. The question was, what do we want? What do we want and dream and hope for out of a facility, out of a building? And what emerged, of course, doesn't obviously require us to move or stay. What emerged is that people care deeply about the physical space that we gather in. There is a hunger for a beautiful, a sacred, a functional space to deepen spiritually and to connect bravely. A space, for example, that if you're in the back of the room and a tall person is standing in front of you, you can still see what's going on. A space with flexibility for worship and beauty in our grounds, with integration of the natural world. At the other end of the building, the kids flow right out from their classrooms onto this wonderful patio space and then out onto the playground. And I'm envious of that, not maybe a little bit because of the playground, but mostly because of that flow from the inside to the outside. People said, staying as is probably won't meet our needs and our hopes for the facility, for the building over time. But the conversation around this new way of building is not just, it does not end with the sort of anxiety-raising acknowledgement that this space doesn't meet our hopes. Because at the same time this year, the Strategic Initiative Committee has been gathering data about what our options are. And they've looked at 3 scenarios for what it would be to stay in the building and 3 scenarios for what it would be to go. And they have been diligently, and they still are, collecting data, analyzing this. The first option of staying is to do nothing, right? We stay, we've gotten along fine in this building for a long time, we can. The thing is, doing nothing turns out to be an extremely expensive option. You know, the heating, the T-junction, this is the tip of the iceberg of systems in the building. Someone told me that on Easter Sunday a few years ago, there was sewage bubbling up in the front yard. Like, buildings get old and have issues. Doing nothing is not free. The second option would be to remodel within these existing walls, and a third option, potentially to do some remodeling and to expand on site. So they're talking with real estate folks, talking with architects to say, all right, give us a rough sense of what the cost would be to remodel or to expand. And then they've also looked at 3 options around leaving this site. The first is to buy a church that meets our needs better. And the trouble is, there are not a lot of churches for sale in Boulder County on a regular basis. A second option would be to buy an existing building and remodel it. There's a school somewhere nearby that's essentially just bought a warehouse. They're going to retrofit this thing and make it work for their needs. We could do something like that. And a third option would be to buy land with nothing on it and build. And they've talked with all sorts of real estate folks, people who are involved, to understand what are those costs? What's the property we're on worth? It's worth somewhere over $3 million, probably, which is a lot of money unless you are trying to buy property in Boulder County. In which case, your house from the 1970s is worth several million dollars now. You know, that's part of the reality. That was part of their work, is to understand what are those costs, what's possible. It is the steady, sober, diligent project work of moving ahead, the partner to the visioning. And in the early fall, September, October, that team's going to report back to you all on those 6 options. And there'll be a whole lot of presentation and conversation and deliberation. But ultimately, what comes from that is the board will ask you, the whole congregation, to decide on which of these to pursue. Which of those options do we want to take to the next step and flesh out and say, all right, concretely, what would that mean for us? One of the things I appreciate most working with the Strategic Initiatives Committee this year, and for that matter, I think the whole congregation that you all know already, but one of the things I hear in those conversations too, is that the point of the congregation is not to make a building possible. The point of a building is to make the congregation possible. A former intern of mine told the story of being in Tanzania. I think she was in the Peace Corps, in a village, a very heavily Catholic village, whose church had been damaged multiple times, and they knew it was going to take them years to rebuild. And so they gathered for Mass each week under an acacia tree. Deep-rooted like the tree, resilient like the tree, and living in the present moment. That community was not waiting for a building before they could start being a community. They were doing it right there. Some congregations, I'm actually not worried about this for us, some congregations get this twisted around, as if the point and the purpose of the community is to maintain the building. This is like the historical society model of doing church. We're not doing that, though, and we know it. I went to a 4th of July parade last year in another state, and 4th of July parade, fire trucks and classic cars and high school marching bands, horse rider associations. And I flipped through the 8-page insert that the local newspaper had given describing the 130-some organizations that were going by. And the one I remember, actually, besides the Humane Society, which had a truck with cats and dogs driving through the parade. Right, that made a great impression. But the description that I remember, the description that sticks with me is this: First Presbyterian Church, the neoclassical church with stained glass windows. Then that was it. That was the totality of the description. What I think they were trying to do was to be recognizable. Among all the churches that are out there, here's what we look like. Fair enough. But the neoclassical church with the stained glass windows, that was it. No further information. It sounded like the church was the building. And then even to recognize it, you need a basic architectural education. What is neoclassical? I Googled this. It turned neoclassical is like the Greek-looking stuff with the sort of triangle pillars holding up the front. Who's the church for? People who like buildings. Our mission is not to serve the building. The building is here to serve the mission for us. And that's a big part of what I heard in the visioning sessions last fall. You all took that so basically for granted. It was beautiful. In the same way that we just take for granted that whatever we're going to do green. We're going to do in a way that's not adding more carbon to the world. A building that's big enough to fit us all. A building that is, in fact, ADA compliant. These ramps are not. These corners are not big enough to take a turn in a walker or a wheelchair. The front down here, I'm sure you've felt this, is not even. You're walking along the front sort of at an angle. Stairs which are designed like regular stairs. The point of all of that is that the question underneath is, who is this place for? And it's not that these are bad things automatically, but they send a message. Who is the place for? Well, the stones ritual is apparently only for folks who can navigate their way down to the front and back up again. The building is only for those folks. Who's the chancel for? People who can get up and down the stairs, or everybody? Those are the sort of choices. A sense of beauty in all of our spaces and a connection to the natural world. It's not just logistics in the building. It's how do we feel when we gather here? And the point of all of those things is to serve the mission. In 1874, the second Unitarian church in Chicago burns down in one of the various Chicago fires. And the building is smoking rubble. And the next day, the whole congregation gathers there. And there's an artist who sketches this, turns it into an engraving, and puts it on the cover, I think, of Collier's, which goes out around the country, this wonderful line art engraving of the preacher on some big block of stone doing this kind of a thing, very preacherish, right? And the whole community there, the building was rubble. The congregation was entirely unharmed. When we're building a new way, we're focusing on the community as much as on the building. We're focusing on how are we together. That's the real substance of this place, rooted and resilient. And that's one of the reasons that this year we've been working to create a healthy congregation team. This is very exciting because now I get to talk about bylaws. I've been waiting for this the whole service. So for many years, we've had a committee on shared ministry whose functions specified by the bylaws the 9 o'clock service got a hooray for bylaws at that point. So, all right. is to evaluate the minister and the ministries of the church, which is a very important thing to do. But the fact is that for years and years, the board has been doing those functions, which also makes sense because the board has the authority to act on them rather than just to make recommendations. Over the years, the Committee on Shared Ministry has also performed a crucial function not specified by the bylaws. Okay. You're waiting to find out what it is, that's fair. Namely, taking ownership, taking responsibility for our congregational covenant of respectful relations, our relational covenant, the promises and commitments we make that you heard earlier in the service about how it is we're going to be together. To formalize and expand that work, the current Committee on Shared Ministry, the current team, has developed a new charter to transform into a healthy congregation team. And you'll read more about this in the coming week, because to make the change, we have to actually amend the bylaws at our annual meeting. Oh, okay. All right, you came around on that one. The Healthy Congregation Team is the group responsible for helping us live out our mission by weaving that covenant of respectful relationships into the life of the congregation. Educating us all about what it is, educating us also about conflict, because conflict is a normal and natural and ordinary thing, and the best time to work on that is when we are not in the middle of it. That Healthy Congregation Team also will serve as a holder of space, not arbitrator or judge, but a holder of space for people in conflict to repair relationships with each other, with conversation grounded in that behavioral covenant and the commitments that we make. And that team will lead all of us in updating the behavioral agreements as our needs and understandings change over time. The poet Philip Booth starts one of his poems saying, "How we get there is where we arrive." How you get there is where you arrive. How we get there as a congregation into our future, how we get there is not just what we do. The real work of the church is not just the strategic plan or the goals and objectives for the coming year. The real work is also the care and connection of the community. It's our rootedness and resilience. I had lunch a few weeks ago with Ben, with our former collaborative keyboardist, and I asked him, what makes the Chancel Cats work? What makes the band work? They don't know I'm about to say this. I asked him, what's working well to keep on supporting? And among the things that he said was this. He said, anyone gets to say, let's try this. And anyone gets to say, well, I don't think that worked. There's a spirit, he said, of collaboration and experimentation which makes room for imperfection, which makes room to try things, and then which makes room, if they don't work, not to be filled with crushing guilt. The conversation doesn't go, hey, let's try this thing. It didn't work. I will never make a suggestion again. Right? The conversation goes, oh yeah, that didn't sound good. Let's not do that. And you move on. That's the practice. That's part of what it is to live into a healthy congregation. It's like that old line, someone told me this about marriage or any relationship, I think. You can be right. You can be right. You can be the one who is right, or you can be in a relationship. Right? Not both of those. Can't do it all the time. Part of our work of being resilient, of undoing conflict, of setting down grudges or resentments, of speaking directly with each other when things are hard, part of that work is a spiritual, a psychological task of letting go of perfectionism. When everything has to be just perfect, You can't take feedback. You can't do things differently. Defensiveness locks you in place. And just like we pay attention to that charge as individuals so that we can live out our values, so we can say, hey, I screwed up, and make room for grace and move on and do differently, just like we do that as individuals. We pay attention to that sort of stuff as a congregation as a whole to live out our mission. Figuring out a new way for our building is complicated, and it takes time and energy and resources, and it is disruptive and exciting, and we need to do it, and we'll figure it out. But our deeper commitment, shared by every one of us, is to build a new way of doing community and life together. Our real commitment is not to a new building. It's to community. It's to make a beautiful space that fits all of us and heals our spirits and inspires us so strongly that our description in the 4th of July parade says nothing about the building, but simply instead, we are a liberal congregation who connects bravely, deepens spiritually, embodies justice, and always loves. That's our commitment. Come stop by. Amen. We rise and embody your spirit. Let's close in song.